The only thing harder to find than a winged unicorn is reliable data on the DPRK. However, if one does dig long enough and hard enough, they will eventually find that information. This video hopefully will give you just that, and with this information it'll hopefully give you a better view of the DPRK. DPRK has a low per capita GDP, 17% of the world average. The Central U.S. Intelligence Agency, or the CIA, estimates that about the 2007 GDP was about $1,700 US, and ranks the country at 189 out of 229 countries. This puts the DPRK amongst the bottom 5 countries in Asia in the same cohort as Laos, Burma, Cambodia, and Bangladesh. Such a low per capita GDP suggests a situation of abject poverty. This picture is reinforced by the common media themes of a mysterious reclusive nation where the government would rather spend money on missiles and nuclear warheads than buy food for a population where millions are suffering from extreme starvation. Going by these numbers, we would assume that the DPRK was some kind of intolerable hellhole. But when we take a further look at the data and place them in the proper context, we get quite a different view. At 72.2 years, DPRK life expectancy is almost 6 years above the world average figure of 66.3. Compared with other poor Asian nations where life expectancy is 9 to 10 years better than Bangladesh, Burma, and Cambodia, and nearly 16 years better than Laos. This infers a much better standard of living conditions and nutrition in the DPRK. When it comes to infant mortality, we see the DPRK much higher than its neighbors that have greater wealth. The worldwide average figure for infant mortality is 42 deaths per 1,000 births. The CIA estimated 2007 rate for North Korea is half this at 22. By contrast, with the other low per capita GDP Asian nations, this is 60% lower than Cambodia and Burma, and 74% lower than Bangladesh. This relatively low infant mortality rate could not be achieved without a comparatively higher standard of education, medical services, clean water supply, and general hygiene. When it comes to commodity ownership, the DPRK can seem quite strange. While they don't have a first world level of commodity consumption, they do have a high rate of television ownership, which is greater than most countries in the same region. In poor countries, a few families can afford a TV set. Available figures indicate that DPRK TV ownership is 7 or 8 times greater than other Asian countries with a comparable GDP. The source believes that television ownership is in fact much higher than reflected by these figures. The impression gained from a field trip to farm cooperatives and visiting family homes in 2007 was that about 50% of rural families had a TV set, and ownership is undoubtedly higher in urban areas. Just looking at raw economic data doesn't give us quite a full picture of how wealth is distributed in the DPRK. The reason for this is because wealth is distributed different in a socialist society than it is in a capitalist society. In a capitalist society, this is primarily done by wages or compensation for labor and other things performed for a capitalist. While in the DPRK, particularly a socialist economy, the wealth in society is distributed as according to a need. There is a social system set up that gives this to the population, bypassing any needs for a particular level of income. Basically, this is a more equitable distribution of the wealth in the country that doesn't necessarily go by actual cash amount the way it would in a capitalist society. This is how the DPRK can have a lower GDP per capita, but have a better living standard than the countries around it with a very similar GDP. As for food production and imports, some commentators claim that food is short in North Korea because the socialist system does not work. To the contrary, the source's field observations and Food and Agriculture Organization crop yield data suggest that agricultural production is quite efficient. Furthermore, the distribution system and markets do work well. The system is not the reason for food shortages. It is not true, as some commentators claim, that food distribution was not working well late into the 1990s. What is true, the system had inadequate food to distribute. The educational standard and technical ability of the DPRK's farm cooperatives are remarkably high. As a result, within constraints of input supply, optimum if not maximum use is made of all arable land. The problem is that there is not enough arable land to fully feed the country's 23 million population. North Korea has never been and will never be able to fully feed the population. Given the available arable land and the limited growing season, it is physically impossible. Historically, shortfalls of food were met by importations from the USSR. Available FAO statistics show that over the past 35 years, the DPRK has on average produced 82% of its cereal requirements and imported 18%. Until the mid-1990s, high cereal yields, mostly rice and corn, but also wheat, barley, millet, and sorghum, were achieved with extensive use of imported fertilizer. Without the preferential trade conditions experienced during the USSR era and restrictions placed by sanctions, the DPRK has not been able to import fertilizer and the necessary quantities of grain to top up the food supply. In this graph, it can be seen that both fertilizer and cereal production trended upwards from 1970 until the early 1990s, when the ability to import fertilizer ceased. The result was an immediate drop in cereal production. The effect a drop in fertilizer supply had can be seen in the per capita food production index published by the FAO. Food production can be seen to have slowly increased over a 20-year period from 1970, peaking in 1990, dropping during the 90s and since recovering, but still only equating mid-1970s levels. Production was adversely affected by extreme weather events during the late 1990s, but this was a complicating factor, not the main cause. The Food Production Per Capita Index presents net food production after deductions for seed and animal feed of a country's agricultural sector per person relative to the base period 1999 to 2001. The Food Production Per Capita Index covered all edible agricultural products that contain nutrients. To strengthen the case to justify food aid, the adverse effects of floods and droughts were overstated. The number of deaths were also overstated. Estimates of the number of deaths during the 1990s vary enormously, from tens of thousands up to 4 million. While it is possible that some tens of thousands died, there is no evidence to support the claims of millions. In 1997, the source traveled quite extensively in South Pyongan and North Pyongan and North Gyeonggi provinces and spoke to many ordinary citizens as well as officials. Half a day each was spent on 12 different cooperative farms. During this time, nobody had spoken to any experience any unusual deaths in their communities. Death rates were normal amongst both the aged and the very young. One would have expected death rates of both young and old to be up during a time of severe famine. The data supplied somewhat reluctantly by authorities in Pyongyang at the time, backed up by the field observations. It was the source's conclusion that if there were any excessive deaths, they would have numbered in the hundreds of thousands, certainly not in the millions. This is not to deny that food was in short supply. It was, but the scarcity was not at starvation levels, as is borne out by available life expectancy and mortality statistics. This brings us to the issue of mortality. If we were to believe the mainstream narrative, then we would assume that millions of people die every single year. A good example of this falsehood is the statement given by Park Yeon-mi, who claimed that there were bodies floating in the Yalu River, and this was a common occurrence. This was debunked by Felix Abt, the man known as the capitalist in North Korea, who took a picture of the river showing that no such thing was actually occurring. UNICEF data shows that crude death rates declined during the 1980s and rose again about 1990 onwards. The crude death rate does not show a huge jump in the middle 1990s, when there was supposed to be a famine, although it has continued to rise since that time, which is probably a reflection of poor nutrition. The infant mortality rate rose from a low of 32 per thousand live births to 42 per thousand live births around 1990 and has remained at that level ever since. Once again, contrary to what might have been expected, there was no dramatic rise in infant mortality during the mid-1990s. This is some of the best economic data that is available on the DPRK. It should be noted that some of it is actually quite a few years old, but this still is the best available. Now, hopefully, this data that I've given you from these sources gives you a better idea of what the country is actually like, so that we may get much closer to the truth and farther away from the propaganda that U.S. imperialism feeds us. Thank you for watching. If you like this program, then please head over to my Patreon page and set up a monthly donation. It's your donations that keep this program running. Also, if you would like, please rate, comment, subscribe, and share in various social media.